Welcome, everyone. I'm Elaine Simon, co-director of the Urban Studies program, and along with David Grazian, also co-director. And we're really excited to have Keeanga Yamahtta-Taylor here as our 36th annual Urban Studies public lecturer. I'm going to give a little bit of background and context about the lecture, and then I'm going to introduce Brent Siebel, who will introduce Keeanga. So be patient. Michael Katz, who was co-director of the program from 83 to 95, conceived of this lecture as having both a pedagogical and a public purpose. Pedagogically, the lecture's embedded in the work of students in the Urban Studies program who are seniors and writing their own senior research projects, carrying out their own senior research projects. And we invite an eminent scholar every year, and the students have a chance to read the work of that scholar and think about the process of doing work. So it becomes kind of a model for their research. And they participate in selecting the speaker, and they develop some questions during our class discussions, and we have a noontime lecture, which we had earlier today, a noontime discussion with the speaker, and they get to ask the questions that came up to them in the discussions. And then on the public side, this is the one event that Urban Studies has that we really try to reach out to as broad an audience as possible, to touch base with both the city government, nonprofit organizations, and friends of urban studies, of which we have quite a few, and we're very grateful for. The lecture now has funding from a generous contribution from the program's founder, Norm Glickman, his wife Elise Pivnik, and alum William Whitty. Norm taught at Penn when he founded the program in the late 60s, early 70s, which is actually the very period that the book covers, the period that was dubbed the urban crisis. And he went on to teach at the University of Texas, Austin, and at Rutgers, where he founded the Center for Urban Policy Research. He remained a stalwart supporter and friend of the program. Elise, who is a planner, who works at Isles, a community development corporation in Trenton, New Jersey, has been working on issues of environmental health and is with us today. Michael Katz passed away a few years ago, and Norm passed away just this last spring. So we stand on the shoulders of some amazing people. I also want to thank Marva Williams, Liz Greenspan, Molly McGlone, who teach sections of the Urban Studies Senior Seminar, and Vicki Kharkov, who is the Urban Studies coordinator, who has pulled a lot of the pieces together to make this event possible. Brent Siebel will introduce our speaker, and Brent was instrumental in our landing Keeanga Yamahtta-Taylor as our lecturer this year. He is an assistant professor of history at Penn, and he writes about liberalism, urban history, poverty, and economic development in the 20th century. And we're thrilled that he has taken on the teaching of one of the most important courses in our curriculum, a course called The Transformation of Urban America. So, Brent, thanks.
Thank you, Elaine, and thank you all for coming from the Penn Urbanist community, graduate and undergraduate students, the broader Philadelphia community and beyond. I've been looking forward to this talk and this event for some time, so this is a real pleasure for me. I'm also going to take advantage of it to plug an event on Thursday. We're fortunate to have another fantastic urban historian coming to Penn, Colin Gordon from the University of Iowa will be here to talk about modern history of inequality, urban history, race, and citizenship in his new book, just out from the University of Chicago Press, Citizen Brown, Race, Democracy, and Inequality in the St. Louis Suburbs. And it's a really devastating look at the history of suburban inequality in modern America in the lead up to the police killing of Michael Brown in Ferguson in 2014. And so he'll be here to set that tragic but utterly unexceptional event in its broader historical, spatial, political, economic, and racial history here in College Hall 209 at 4:30 on Thursday. So I'd love to see as many of you as possible as we can at that event. But on to our business here tonight. We're so fortunate to have Keeanga Yamahtta-Taylor with us. In her day job, she is assistant professor of African American Studies at Princeton, but Professor Taylor has already taken her place among the leading public intellectuals of our time. For some time now, her writing has been appointment reading for me and thousands, millions of others. Her work on race and social justice, inequality, social movements in America's recent past and its present have appeared in the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, the Boston Review, the Paris Review, the Guardian, the Nation, Jacobin, Souls, and more. And so for some time I've been awaiting the book she's here to discuss with us tonight, which has been the product of years of painstaking research, the work of a dissertation, a PhD dissertation. And so when I received my copy a couple of weeks ago, I ended up reading it in 2 sittings and did something that I've never really felt as much urgency to do before. I sat down immediately and revised my lecture on cities in the 1970s. Seriously, for my urban studies and urban history class on American cities that Elaine mentioned. And the timing was good because I had to give the lecture the following week. And so I normally would sort of let that sit, let it lie, maybe come back to it the next time around, but I felt, I knew that if I delivered the lecture as I'd written it literally just 8 months prior, so like 9 months ago at this point, I would be robbing my students of history that was urgently important and that fundamentally revised our assumptions about cities in the 1970s and since. Far from an era of benign or even malign neglect, Professor Taylor's concept of predatory inclusion, which I'm sure she'll talk about tonight, and her rendering of racial capitalism in such stark and legible terms demanded immediate inclusion in my survey of American urban history. And the next time I teach the class, the book itself will be on the syllabus too, I'm sure. But to be completely honest, I wasn't caught off guard at all by the urgency of feeling the need to incorporate her work into my writing and teaching, since each of her other books have already demanded inclusion in the canons of political history, race, social movements, and urban history. Her edited volume, How We Get Free, Black Feminism, and the Combahee River Collective, which won the Lambda Literary Award for LGBTQT nonfiction in 2018, is a necessary compendium of interviews, recollections, and calls to action and conscience from founding members of the collective as well as contemporary activists who are placing intersectionality at the center of movements for social justice and freedom. Likewise, Professor Taylor's first book, From Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation, on the Black freedom struggle and the dominant racial order of the last century or so of American politics, is a forceful, and I think really, and I've said this to you before, breathtakingly economical blend of historical analysis and polemic, and is essential for really all students of American politics, democracy, capitalism, and citizenship to reckon with, as my students will this spring in my survey of American politics, The Age of Reagan. So that'll be on the syllabus for sure. And so tonight, she's here to talk to us and teach us about her new book, Race for Profit, How Banks and the Real Estate Industry Undermined Black Homeownership, which was just released by the University of North Carolina Press, and it has already been longlisted for the National Book Award for Nonfiction. Please join me in welcoming to Penn Professor Keeanga Yamahtta-Taylor.
Thank you so much for that warm introduction, Brett. I'm happy to be part of a tight-knit circuit of urbanists that Brett is a part of, and who I have learned a tremendous amount from. I want to thank the organizers for the invitation to come speak to you about my book today. It's a tremendous honor. Michael Katz is a permanent fixture on my syllabi, both for my race and public policy class, but also my class on African American history from Reconstruction to the present. So it is no exaggeration to say that it is a tremendous honor to be invited to deliver this lecture. I also want to thank the staff of Urban Studies and the departments that came together to make tonight possible. So what I'm going to do is, I'd say that this is a talk that lends itself to visual elements, but it's also a somewhat intricate story that I am trying to weave together. And so I'm going to talk for probably 40 minutes, and I hope that it is provocative in the best meaning of that word, and that we're able to have some dialogue about this era. So I'll get started. Last July, in a now typical spasm of racist vitriol, Donald Trump described the city of Baltimore as a, quote, rat and rodent infested mess that no human being would want to live in. It was cruel and thinly coated veil invoked to disparage the hardship of Black working class communities of that city. In doing so, it also conveyed a fatalistic disregard for those conditions while expressing a decided lack of ambition to actually attend to something as serious as rodent infestation. Despite Trump's rhetoric, rat infestation in Black, poor, and working class communities is not evidence of African American indifference to conditions in their neighborhood, but rats have always been markers of substandard housing that thrives in the enclosure of residential segregation. The menace of rats in Black working class neighborhoods in the 1960s also inspired ridicule from mean-spirited white conservatives in government then. And it also sparked activism and even uprisings. In August 1967, nearly 2 weeks after riots in Detroit prompted the rare deployment of federal troops in an American city, dozens of demonstrators burst into the Chamber of Representatives chanting, "Rats cause riots." Days earlier, Congress had rejected a 2-year, $40 million bill to exterminate rats in inner cities across the country. The protesters sat in the gallery for 20 minutes, repeating the slogan, "We want a rat bill." The previous attempt at passing the bill had not merely been voted down, but had been ridiculed in the process. A Virginia Republican mocked the legislation to howls of laughter from other white representatives, saying, "Mr. Speaker, I think the rat smart thing for us to do is vote this rat bill down right now." One of his colleagues mocked it as another civil rights bill. No laughing matter for the people who lived in the inner city. Rats were the most visceral example of the unequal living conditions forced onto Black people in mid-century America. In the 1960s, African American media regularly reported on rat attacks on the most vulnerable members of Black urban households, children. Lorraine McTush, a single African American mother, complained to a Chicago Defender reporter that she stayed up most nights because of rats. The rats crawling in her bed, which made her nervous, and the rats in her children's bed, which terrified her. "They get into the bunk beds, and so I sit up all night. I am miserable and afraid." 2 days before his first birthday, little Andrew Adams was, according to Jet magazine, chewed to death by a rat while sleeping in his crib. A death so shocking that more than 1,000 African Americans gathered on Chicago's West Side in protest. One activist recalled the prior summer's deadly riot, saying, "Remember Watts." The article went on to describe in grisly detail the infant's remains. Quote, "When he lay in his crib, you could see the holes where the rats had chewed. The little finger on his right hand was tied on with a string." Chicago health officials disagreed, claiming that the child died of malnutrition, but nevertheless conceded that rats had fed on his dead body. Civil rights leader Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who spoke at a hastily organized protest, reminded the crowd, "This is why we are fighting slums in Chicago." The rat infestation in Black neighborhoods was profound. When African American children in a Chicago neighborhood were given a vocabulary test and asked to identify various familiar objects, more than 60% of the children misidentified a rat as a teddy bear. In the aftermath of riots in Philadelphia in 1964, a city-commissioned report found that 100% of reported rat bites happened in segregated Black majority neighborhoods. Housing segregation, maintained through a vexing combination of white violence, public policy, and the exclusionary practices of the private sector, ensured the dilapidated and substandard condition of Black housing. These were the evidence of exclusion and enclosure, and they boiled over into the electricity of successive waves of uprisings across the country in the 1960s. In the weeks after the uprising in Detroit in 1967, a Washington Post poll forcefully linked deteriorating conditions in Black communities with the uprisings. Fully 70% of Blacks attributed rioting to housing conditions. 59% of African Americans said they knew someone living in rat-infested housing. 57% reported holes in their ceiling. 49% said their housing was overcrowded. And 68% reported cockroaches in their homes. In the poll, even 39% of whites said that they believed that the conditions of Black housing were responsible for ongoing rioting. By the end of the 1960s, the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders, known as the Kerner Commission, had left no doubt that substandard housing, evidenced by rat infestation among many other things, was a recurring factor in the annual bouts of riots that roiled American cities throughout the decade. Identifying segregation at the root of these causes, of these conditions, and as a significant source of rage in Black communities, the Commission's findings called for historic changes to American housing policies. A landmark Supreme Court case, Jones versus Mayer, decided just weeks after the passage of the Fair Housing Act in the spring of 1968, drew upon the 1866 Civil Rights Act and the 13th Amendment in comparing housing segregation to slavery, arguing, quote, "When racial discrimination herds men into ghettos and makes their ability to buy property turn on the color of their skin, then it is a relic of slavery." The final piece of the battle to open the US housing market to African Americans came with the Housing and Urban Development Act in August of 1968. The 1968 Act was Lyndon Johnson's last greatest legislative accomplishment. It was a bill planned in collaboration with representatives from private enterprise in what was known as the Kaiser Commission. The businessmen who participated in their promotion of single-family homeownership for poor people, they referred to it as socio-commercial enterprise, business with a conscience. Johnson described the legislation as the Magna Carta for the cities, but its focus on the market and ownership ensured that it was a bipartisan bill. For decades, federal officials had relied on public housing to shelter poor and low-income people. But by the end of the 1960s, public housing had become politically untenable, with endless jousts over its maintenance, location, and inhabitants. Housing for the poor suffered from a mixture of government neglect and shrinking tenancy, a result of the dangerous conditions endured by residents and the constant pressure for such housing to exclude anyone other than the poorest tenants. The HUD Act was a pivot away from the notion of public or state responsibility for housing the poor or low income. At the heart of the legislation was a low-income homeownership plan that aimed to transform low-income renters into homeowners. Federal officials turned to homeownership as a cheaper program where the cost of the houses were to be absorbed by the program participants, while the federal government paid regular subsidies to banks, which kept the state's cost lower than the upfront expenses necessary to develop, build, and manage public housing. These economic concerns also fit with the growing idea that homeownership could stabilize the anger and restiveness coursing through American cities. Freshman Senator Charles H. Percy, a Republican from Illinois, described the benefits of expanding homeownership as, quote, "a new dawn of opportunity on which a new national effort to bring dignity and a better life to today's slum dwellers must be based. We can democratize our cities. We can give people of the ghetto a piece of the action, let them be somebody, and achieve something. Richard Nixon said of the bill, quote, "People who own their own homes don't burn their neighborhoods. Rather, in pride and self-interest, they turn to fixing up their communities and making them livable for themselves and their neighbors." The terms of the new homeownership program were a low $200 down payment, 20% of a participant's income as their mortgage, regardless of the cost of the house, and interest rates that were capped at 1%. The inclusion of federal mortgage insurance for the first time meant that in the worst case scenario, the event of a foreclosure or abandonment, the federal government was obligated to step in and pay back the mortgage to the lenders. These terms kept the price of the homes manageable for low-income and working-class people, but it also removed almost all of the risk for the real estate industry. As one official described the program, quote, "It's like doing business in heaven. You can't lose money." The unprecedented program linked federal agencies to real estate brokers and mortgage bankers to supply loans for housing to people in neighborhoods that these organizations had previously excluded or redlined. But with the promise of lucrative subsidies and the guarantees of mortgage insurance and the promise of profit that came with them, the historic hostility of these private sector forces melted away. But these same conditions also opened new pathways for corrupt real estate practices. Speculators and brokers bought up cheap, dilapidated properties, hoping to flip them for higher prices and sales to people who would qualify for the new programs. The entirety of the low-income homeownership programs were in the hands of real estate operatives. HUD sent brokers lists of eligible properties. When a real estate broker matched a person with a home, with a house, they connected the prospective buyer with a mortgage lender. The mortgage lender consulted with HUD to determine if the person qualified for the program. But at no time did an individual seeking to buy a house ever speak with a representative of the local, state, or federal government. But not only could money be made from flipping cheap properties, brokers found it easy to bribe poorly paid appraisers to inflate the value of the cost of houses in the new urban market. Bankers made money on the front end of the real estate deal by securing the loan in the first place, and then they made money on the back end of the deal through expensive closing costs. Everyone made money, except the poor Black families that were disproportionately saddled with these broken homes across the country. The federal government's turn to home ownership was also a consummate expression of post-war racial liberalism, which viewed inclusion into American democracy through the vehicles of citizenship, law, and free market capitalism as the key to unlocking equality and social mobility for Black citizens, just as it had done for white Americans through the New Deal and the GI Bill after World War II. But in narrowing their focus to access alone, racial liberals overlooked the racist practices embedded within those institutions. This was shockingly clear in the real estate industry. Banks and real estate had played the central role in the urban housing crisis, exemplified by the presence and persistence of rats in Black housing. So the sudden involvement of these same private sector forces in a program touted as a solution to the urban housing crisis was a recipe for disaster. This obviously did not mean that Black people should continue to be excluded. Rather, it demanded greater scrutiny, greater enforcement of rules regarding the protection of civil rights, and specific plans to undo the practices that had resulted in Black exclusion in the first place. Without that level of scrutiny and the threat of behavior-altering punishment, there was nothing in place to prevent the continuation of those practices. Instead of scrutiny and regulation, predatory practices continued. In other words, the racist exclusion of African Americans gave way to what I describe as predatory inclusion. The notion of risk facilitated the charade of race neutrality as the neighborhood conditions and financial insecurity of African Americans that had been created by the racist actions and behavior of government agencies, bankers, and real estate brokers were now twisted into evidence that African Americans should be treated cautiously in the marketplace as consumers. Predatory inclusion described the different and more expensive and ultimately exploitative terms upon which Black people were admitted into the world of conventional real estate practices under the guise of colorblind neutrality. In reality, decades of color-conscious exclusion created poverty and the conditions of dilapidation and deterioration in working class and poor Black communities that were then used as visual proof that these neighborhoods, and most importantly, the people who lived in those neighborhoods, posed a threat, represented a risk to property values and loan repayment. More generally, predatory inclusion described the ways that African Americans were welcomed into institutions and practices from which they had formerly been excluded because there were new, supposedly colorblind ways in which they could be extracted from or financially exploited. In the supposed colorblind, race-neutral American marketplace, Black investment in the housing market could result in credit shattering, insurmountable debt, with no hope of their homes ever gaining value over time. This, of course, did not mean that the homes of Black people had no value. Black housing, even in its greatest distress, could be a fortress of refuge, places of communion, and sites of connection. But rarely was it the financial asset that it had been for millions of white Americans. But it was this issue of value that so much of the housing market turned on. The key to the American dream of home ownership was not just simple possession of property, but just as important was whether the value of that property would rise over time, increasing the owner's equity. In a society with an anemic social welfare state, the boost in home values were determinative of one's quality of life. The ascending value of a home could help finance a college education, an unforeseen financial crisis, or contribute to a comfortable retirement. But homes did not ascend or descend in value on their own terms. The surrounding neighborhood and the value or lack of value of other buildings, businesses, and other institutions helped to determine whether a neighborhood was good or bad. In the United States, value was also shaped by whether a property owner was white or Black, surrounded by other white people or surrounded by Black people. There is a perception in our society that value is intrinsic, tangible, real. We know what has value when we see it just as clearly as we understand the lack of value when we see it. But in this way, value within the housing market is socially constructed, a strange alchemy of race, place, and the perceptions of the buying public. Or as sociologist Dalton Conley puts it, property values are where culture meets economics. Frederick M. Babcock, considered an originator of real estate appraisal, wrote in his seminal book, The Appraisal of Real Estate, quote, "It is obvious that there is no absolute ironclad method of computing real estate values, because values are a social phenomenon dependent upon human behavior. The intensely subjective process of determining the value of property or a neighborhood, what I refer to as the pseudoscience of real estate appraisal, was inherently informed by the presence or absence of African Americans. The American Institute of Real Estate Appraisers said as much when its professional manual maintained, quote, "The clash of nationalities with dissimilar cultures contribute to the destruction of value. When a new class of people, of a different race, color, nationality, and culture move into a neighborhood, old inhabitants think that the neighborhood is losing desirability. Thus, the intensity of anti-Black racism in American society was inevitably wound into notions of property value, neighborhood, and community value. The assumption that African Americans were harmful to property values drove the desire to keep them segregated. It justified their marginalization in the housing market. It offered a common sense explanation for the disproportionate conditions of dilapidation, distress, and substandard housing, largely owned by whites and rented to African Americans. This difference in value in white housing compared to Black housing produced a tension between exchange value and use value in housing, or more intimately, the difference between real estate and a home. These contradictory objectives of real estate and a home, one a commodity and the other intimating a place of belonging, also reinforced reactionary racial norms and deepened the perception of dual housing markets working at dual purposes. Mid-century narratives of normative whiteness embodied in conceptions of the suburban-based nuclear family shaped the perceptions of home as an expression of use value within white communities. Conversely, developing narratives concerning perceived domestic dysfunction within Black living spaces, whether non-normative family formations or poverty or dilapidated living structures, cast Black dwellings as incapable of achieving the status of home, thus reducing them to their base exchange value. Where white housing was seen as an asset developed through inclusion and the accruable possibilities of its surrounding property, Black housing was marked by its exclusion and isolation, where value was extracted, not imbued. These racialized narratives of families, communities, and their built environments reinforced and naturalized the segregative practices among real estate brokers, mortgage bankers, and the white public. Indeed, these perceptions of insurmountable difference, steeped in the permanence of blood, race, and culture, constituted the underwriting criteria that demanded who was to be excluded and who should be included. In this way, segregation became profitable. Value accrued to white housing the further it was from African Americans and their neighborhoods. But value could also be found in segregated and distressed housing for Black people. Only the value did not flow to the Black homeowner or property owner. Black people functioned as vessels through which capital flowed from enclosed Black neighborhoods out to banks and real estate operatives. Real estate confined each group to its own section of a single housing market to preserve the allure of exclusivity for whites while satisfying the demand of housing for African Americans. This was not, however, evidence of a dual housing market, but of a single housing market that tied race to risk, linking both to the rise and fall of property values and generating profits that grew into the sinew that bound it all together. White housing and white neighborhoods did well because Black housing and Black neighborhoods were robbed of federal subsidies, investment, and mortgage guarantees. A white housing market would have actually been unintelligible without its Black counterpart. Both relied on the other to make each legible. One could not have existed without the other. This reality exposed the thinness of American liberalism, where inclusion alone was offered as a palliative to the rigid structures of white supremacy that held the market together, the governing institutions, and the law itself. The collusive relationship between the public and private sector and the production of public policy, housing policy, undermined the potential for inclusion to make meaning of Black citizenship. These limits became starkly clear with the new Housing and Urban Development Act of 1968. Consider the experiences of Janice Johnson. On September 18th, 1970, Janice Johnson bought her first home in Philadelphia with a mortgage guaranteed by the Federal Housing Administration. By all previous standards, Johnson was an atypical buyer. She was a Black single mother on welfare, living with her 8-year-old son in a decaying apartment in a building that had been recently condemned by city officials. Now facing eviction, Johnson needed to quickly find a new place to live when she found an apartment for rent in the same neighborhood. Johnson called the landlord in anticipation, but her hopes were dashed when he told her that she could not rent the apartment because she was a welfare recipient. The landlord quickly pivoted from offering a rental to suggesting that Janice Johnson buy a house in the same neighborhood. As a welfare recipient, Johnson qualified for one of HUD's new low-income homeownership programs and was thus able to purchase a house with an FHA-backed loan for $5,600. But within weeks, Janice Johnson realized that her home was not the fulfillment of the American dream. It was the beginning of her American nightmare. Within days of moving into her new house, the sewer line broke in the basement, spewing wastewater all over the floor. The electricity for the house was sporadic and haphazard. There were holes and other irregularities in the foundation of the home. The compromised structure of the house was not the worst of it. On Halloween night, Johnson's 8-year-old son woke up to find a rat in his bed. Janice Johnson saw rats throughout her house, including in the kitchen and bathroom. She called the agent who sold her the house to complain about its condition. He sent workmen out on a couple of occasions, and they even patched the falling plaster in her dining room. But soon after, the real estate agent reminded her that the problems in her house were now her own. They were what he called homeowner's business. These kinds of miserable and dangerous housing conditions in the existing urban market led people to walk away from homes that they had recently purchased, and the numbers of defaults, foreclosures, and FHA insurance payments began to rise. By the end of 1973, 10% of Section 235 homes, one of the homeownership programs created by the '68 HUD Act, were in foreclosure, along with tens of thousands of more in other FHA-assisted low-income homeownership programs. In May of 1974, HUD was in possession of 78,000 single-family homes that had been foreclosed upon through these programs. Indeed, congressional investigations into impropriety in the homeownership program showed that federal appraisers were taking bribes and inflating the value of dilapidated homes by 3 or 4 times their actual worth. Local mortgage bankers were also accused of accepting bribes and to ignore inconsistencies in paperwork in order to authorize even more mortgage loans. Newspaper reports and hundreds of federal indictments identified local FHA officials, appraisers, real estate agents, and mortgage lenders as all involved in the swindle. These were not only scandals, but crimes that had been committed against poor and working class African Americans. In cities as diverse as Chicago, Detroit, Philadelphia, Seattle, San Jose, California, Columbia, South Carolina, real estate brokers, FHA officials, and mortgage bankers were arrested and indicted for a criminal conspiracy to commit fraud. By 1974, 28 HUD officials had been indicted for their role in the housing scandal, along with other mortgage bankers and real estate brokers. The FBI, by the end of that year, had 1,930 investigations open into fraud in the HUD homeownership programs. The crisis in the programs coincided with an end to the long post-war economic boom that had been the foundation of the American dream. Instead, by the end of 1973, unemployment was on the rise, creating the economic conundrum of stagflation. The onset of recession, the deepest since the 1930s, created a political opportunity to roll these programs back by stoking the racial resentment of white suburbanites and the perception that these programs were for undeserving African Americans. This opportunity helped to shape the political climate that allowed the Nixon administration to implement their long-held plan to shift power back to the states when it came to the distribution of social welfare. The overriding objective was to unravel the Johnson welfare state and to replace it with revenue sharing, block grants, and a devolved role of the federal government, while promoting an agenda of local control of the distribution of social welfare funds for cities and states. While there had been bipartisan support for low-income homeownership, the mounting scandals were becoming a political problem. Advocates and other elected officials also argued that there should be less emphasis on existing housing and more of a focus on building new homes in cities to give African Americans more, better, and cheaper housing options. This was certainly not in Nixon's plans, not after he had carefully cultivated the white silent majority coalition made up of disaffected white suburbanites who fought to keep their communities exclusive. The growing spectacle of scandal and mounting foreclosures within the HUD homeownership programs generated the momentum for the right to attack on these housing policies. The political attacks were, of course, not confined to housing, but the entire social welfare state came into question. These programs had largely been won in part largely in part to the insurgent Black movement that had helped to redefine Black poverty and inequality as part of the exclusive policies of the state, rampant discrimination, and capitalism itself. From the March on Washington's insistence on freedom and jobs, to Malcolm X's link between capitalism and racism, to Stokely Carmichael coining the phrase institutional racism, to the Black Panther Party's anti-capitalist, anti-colonial framing, the movement had clearly identified the foundation of Black inequality, and more importantly, the need for programs that addressed structural inequality. So to effectively undermine these programs then, the right attacked the participants as undeserving, ungrateful, and ultimately untrustworthy. For the HUD homeownership programs, this meant demonizing the poorest of the program participants as undeserving recipients of HUD subsidies and mortgage guarantees. The effort to encourage low-income homeownership among African Americans was castigated as a bizarre and naive exercise in social engineering. As an Ohio congressman, Tom Ashley tartly argued, quote, "You cannot run a middle-class program in the ghetto." Members of Congress and news reporters turned their attention to the poorest participants of the programs, Black women on welfare who had been aggressively targeted to become homeowners. These women, many of whom had been recruited from deteriorating public housing complexes, were particularly vulnerable to buying homes that were in poor condition because they were desperate for housing for themselves and their children. But when questions surfaced about the condition of their housing as an act of self-preservation, HUD investigators linked the distressed housing to the homemaking skills of Black women like Janice Johnson. In one hearing in 1970 to discuss the growing problems within these homeownership programs, HUD Secretary George Romney, former governor of Michigan, complained, quote, "In the case of lower income families, you have many who have not had the responsibility of homeownership previously, and therefore there is a greater tendency on their part to not undertake the work necessary to maintain the home." Some officials were even more explicit in their attacks. Georgia Congressman Ben Blackburn, a Republican, said, quote, "The problem is that we have been putting families into homes who have no sense of responsibility of home ownership, and that is where the problem has been, and that is the intrinsic problem in the program. We have found welfare mothers whose sole income was aid for dependent children, plus other benefits that come from that status in life. And they were put in housing, presumably as owners, and yet they could not even fix a faucet washer. Have we concluded that there are some people who should not be put in the status of home purchaser? Can we not conclude that there are some people who do not have the sense of responsibility or the economic income to own a home?" Of course, there was the undeniable irony of the rich white men of Congress who relied upon Black women as maids and caretakers for their families, now complaining about their homemaking skills. But there was a larger issue. Focusing on African American women's housekeeping skills or housekeeping abilities deflected attention from the more pressing question of why the FHA, HUD, the federal government, was insuring properties in uninhabitable condition. After all, an earlier audit of HUD's homeownership programs concluded, quote, "No homeowner can be expected to cope with poor construction, cracked foundations, improper wiring, and a general failure of contractors to meet local building and maintenance requirements." It is also important to say that Black women were not just victims of this kind of abuse, and it was their willingness to seek out help and use the resources of legal aid to engage in litigation about the criminal aspects of this program that meant that the problems in these programs came to light. By the mid-1970s, especially in Philadelphia, Black women were at the helm of important grassroots organizing efforts as well. These efforts were intended to make HUD and the FHA fulfill their promises to repair the broken houses that had been sold to them under the watch of those organizations. Other activists also rejected this kind of victim blaming. One homeowner turned activist from Chicago described the devastating effects of HUD's failed programs as, quote, "the outright murder of our neighborhoods in America, aided and abetted by the Federal Housing Administration, the mortgage industry, the insurance industry, and the unscrupulous real estate industry. These four institutions are working together to systematically destroy what's left of America's cities. What for so long has been considered a natural phenomenon, changing neighborhoods, deteriorating cities, are not natural. It's an outright plan, and the government, the realtors, and the big money people are making a lot of money out of changing neighborhoods, out of the communities that we call home." But Nixon officials were able to use the spectacular fraud and corruption within HUD's homeownership programs as evidence that the government should get out of the business of housing poor and low-income people. The highly visible collapse of the low-income homeownership programs not only raised questions about the role of the state in housing people, but it also allowed officials to gain support for keeping poor and working-class Black people out of white suburban communities. In January of 1973, in his last act as HUD's secretary, George Romney announced a national moratorium on the construction of all federally subsidized housing programs, including all FHA-assisted low-income homeownership programs. Months later, Nixon would tell Congress, quote, "All across America, the federal government has become the biggest slumlord in history. Leaders of all political persuasions and from all levels of government agree that the federally subsidized housing approach has failed." Instead, he suggested, quote, "Of the policy alternatives available, the most promising way to achieve decent housing for all our families at an acceptable cost appears to be direct cash assistance." This was the beginning of the federal turn to Section 8 housing vouchers, first issued in 1974. The introduction of vouchers was coupled with the demand from the Nixon administration that the existing housing stock be utilized for low-income housing. Existing housing was understood to be in cities. It existed, further cementing the racial division in low-income housing. Meanwhile, the administration secured $3 billion for the construction of new low-income homes that were all but guaranteed to be built in suburbs and largely reserved for white residents. With existing housing in the cities for Black renters and new construction in the suburbs for white buyers, Nixon's segregated vision of housing in the United States was fulfilled. In closing, when Ronald Reagan became president in 1980, he called for HUD to convene a special commission on housing policy. For more than 30 years, the federal government had pledged to provide decent homes for its citizens. through its Department of Housing and Urban Development, and it consistently failed to achieve that goal. The latest Housing Commission, paneled by Reagan, called its report To House a Nation, and it began with the criticism of the HUD Act of 1968. The HUD Act had left as its legacy, quote, a belief in the potency of government programs. Reagan's Commission on Housing promised the opposite. Quote, the genius of the market economy, freed from the distortions forced by government housing policies and regulations that swing erratically from loving to hostile, can provide for better housing, can provide for housing far better than federal programs. It was a conclusion that could only be reached by ignoring the actual origins of the HUD Act and the reasons behind its demise. Lyndon Johnson had also promised to unleash the, quote, genius of private industry as the key to unlocking the mystery of perpetual housing crises. But lackadaisical management, erratic regulation, and trenchant racial discrimination, combined with the end of redlining and the predacious inclusion of formerly excluded Black urbanites, allowed the real estate industry to bleed inner cities dry. It was not government intrusion that sank the FHA-assisted low-income homeownership programs. It was government negligence. But this malfeasance was not just an issue of poorly motivated personnel. It was the outcome of mismatched objectives and impossible tasks. When public policies are guided by the objectives of private enterprise, as the HUD homeownership programs undoubtedly were, they are clenched in a dance of conflict. As magnanimous as life as the titans of business who argued for socio-commercial enterprise in the 1960s tried to present themselves, in the end, the objective of profit-making outpaced the necessity for safe and sound housing. One glaring reason for this spoke to the heart of the conflict. Real estate profits were rooted in residential segregation. There is a tendency to view the post-riot city as trapped in the stasis of blight and the inevitability of decay over time. But the late 1960s and 1970s were actually defined by changing political, social, and economic dynamics, and the inner city was at the nexus of these processes. New financial instruments, such as mortgage-backed securities, produced an intense demand for more homeowners and more money for home financing, while lax oversight and regulation incentivized unscrupulous and predatory targeting of urban communities. Far from being a static site of dilapidation and ruin, the urban core was becoming an attractive place of unparalleled opportunity, a new frontier of economic investment and extraction for the real estate and banking industries. The race for profit in the 1970s transformed blighted urban space into what one US senator described as a, quote, golden ghetto, where profits for banks and real estate brokers were never ending, and shattered credit and ruined neighborhoods were all that remained for African Americans who lived there. These are not just important historical lessons, but they have direct bearing on the communities and neighborhoods we live in today. Housing policies over much of the 20th century, and certainly the housing crisis of the 1970s, contributed to the uneven development of Black urban and suburban communities in comparison to white urban and suburban communities. The geographic scars created by the HUD FHA crisis were nearly 80,000 single-family homes were repossessed, but hundreds of thousands of more multifamily units also went into foreclosure, exacerbated a crisis of abandonment that animated the optics of distress and dilapidation. A generation later, these conditions became the basis for designating a place and the people who lived there as subprime. For more than 50 years now, the private sector has been viewed as the most capable of ending the persisting urban housing crisis. And yet these crises have become even more stark over time, creating even greater degrees of housing precariousness. This is especially true in the realm of homeownership. The acceleration of subprime lending in the atmosphere of deregulation in the late 1990s and early 2000s resulted in unprecedented home losses for Black people. The practice of subprime lending was contingent on racial practices and assumptions across the housing industry and among the general public. The cascade of foreclosures and mortgage defaults further eroded the value of properties in Black communities, once again, hollowing out the notion of homes as assets for African Americans. The net loss of more than 240,000 homes for African Americans has created the pretext for mortgage lenders to once again engage in exclusionary practices that marginalize potential Black home buyers. But this is only one aspect of the crisis. The recurring perception of risky Black buyers has opened pathways for the reemergence of naked, predatory practices in the real estate market. From rent-to-own schemes to the reappearance of land installment contracts in lieu of conventional mortgages, real estate continues to pilfer African Americans in search of their American dream in the housing market. This is not history repeating itself. This is the predictable outcome of when the home is a commodity and continues to be promoted as the fulfillment and meaning of citizenship. Thank you.
We have time for a few questions.
Let's go. Got one right here.
I really can't say I have a question, but you hit something that hit me because all of the things that you said I could follow its evolution. Particularly, I come from a place called Mantua.
Yes.
And Mantua is on this north side of Market and is considered the bottom.
Mm.
And in reality, it's always been the golden bottom, but we couldn't see it. We didn't know it, so we sought to escape from it.
Mm-hmm.
So today, when you look at the community, based on this pattern of how real estate business is done, and I don't make no excuse about also saying that the universities are a part of the real estate issue in these communities. Penn got the south side, Drexel has the north side. All of that impacts the housing market and what is happening. Unfortunately, again, the message is too late. The train has already left. So you can try and preserve if you can, but the cost of being able to get into your neighborhoods and even maintain, based upon the presentation that you gave and in following where it is now, is really a sad story.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really what I wanted to say.
Thank you. Thank you. Just one in the back. I can't hear.
The fair housing commissions that were established across the country, have they had any effect in movement of housing for people, middle class and people?
Do you mean the
Poor people.
original fair housing legislation?
Yes.
No. I mean, the problem with fair housing is the problem that happens with a lot of civil rights legislation in this country is that it is racial discrimination is deemed illegal, a practice that must immediately be banned. And then it is followed by an incredibly weak regime of enforcement that means that there is no particular penalty or punishment for engaging in the practices. And so I described the process by which HUD was to implement its fair housing policies earlier. So I'll describe that again briefly, which is when the legislation is passed in '68, it creates a civil rights division within HUD that is supposed to enforce fair housing and to root out racial discrimination in housing. And so the first appropriation for this new office is $6 million, $5 million of which is supposed to go to staffing, which leaves $1 million for 120 employees to investigate all claims of racial discrimination in the United States. So on its face, there is no serious commitment to enforcing anti-discrimination law. And I would argue that part of the problem, even if we're just looking narrowly at the question of housing programs and housing discrimination, is that this reliance on the private sector to be the sole producer of housing in the United States, in fact, undermines the ability of the federal government to regulate its own policies. It's difficult to regulate and police your partner. It's even more difficult to do that when you are completely dependent on that partner to produce the social good that is housing. And so, I think when people ask what should be done, there are a lot of things that we can talk about that should be done, but the immediate one is to develop an actual rigorous and serious effort around enforcing the existing civil rights laws, rules, and regulations in regards to housing discrimination. Up front here.
Thank you for your lectures. Very good lecture. You addressed a couple things, redlining, and I wanted to know if your book elaborates on University of Penn's position on redlining since they implemented it, and addressed the woman's comment up there how Penn had predatory land acquisitions with the Black Bottom in Philadelphia. Do you address that in the book?
No. So the book is I teach at Princeton. I could talk to you about slavery at Princeton. I don't know about the real estate practices here surrounding the campus, although there's obvious issues that I know from people who've lived in West Philly about gentrification practices. And I think in college campuses around the country, especially private institutions, increasingly resemble kind of more business practices than the kind of collegial neighborly practices. But I think these are old. I mean, one of the most important kind of histories about urban renewal practices is Arnold Hirsch's Making of the Second Ghetto, which talks in detail about the role of the University of Chicago in its massive displacement of poor and working class Black families that surrounded the university as a way to make the university safe and desirable for its almost exclusively white population. I would imagine there's probably some similarity to the practices here, even if I don't know them directly or with any specificity. I lost the first part of your question. So the book is pretty tight from 64 or 68 to 74. It's really looking at what gave rise to the Housing and Urban Development Act and how those policies embedded in that were upended with the Housing and Community Development Act, whatever that is, six years later, and how there could be such a tremendous sea change in public policies and public attitudes about what the role of the state should be in such a small period of time. So it's a tight period of time, but that there is a tremendous amount of activity happening here.
That's a lot of pressure. Thank you for that excellent presentation.
Thank you.
You make you show the continuum coming up into the early 2000s, which I thought was very useful and important. I'd like to point you to a little bit of time before that.
Sure.
And looking at some of Richard Rothstein and Ta-Nehisi Coates, and I can't help but see the parallels there with regard to this time when they tried to create housing affirmatively for white people, and how the areas that we tend to have a narrative of golden cows of liberalism, LBJ, the New Deal in Coates in Rothstein, and in fact, these sacred cows become Trojan horses. And so I'd like you to talk about some of the comparison to that prior period.
Comparison in terms of creating housing opportunity
In
for...
terms of what would seem in the conventional narrative to be these great steps forward of liberalism and a more inclusive society, in fact, only fuel a very parasitic form of capitalism that in the end leaves these same communities in worse positions sometimes.
I mean, that in large part is what I'm trying to convey. I think that what I'm trying to really get into a deeper discussion about is the processes by which those public policies are produced, you know, as well as the outcomes. So, you know, Richard Rothstein, I think, has done an important service in kind of popularizing the role of the federal government in creating much of the segregation, or not creating. I mean, he says that it's creating these practices, but I think that in doing so, that he perhaps underemphasizes the role of the private sector, and even more importantly than just, is it the public sector, is it the private sector, is really understanding the relationship between the two is what is really most troubling, which is to say that in the 1930s, when the US is first formulating its first kind of national housing policies, as is typical with the federal government when it seeks to open a new pathway or endeavor, it goes to the quote unquote experts to determine the ways in which it should do that. And the experts in fomenting housing policy come from the real estate and banking industries. And, you know, their expertise is deeply rooted in kind of eugenic inspired understandings of race that are involved in the practices of segregation much earlier than the federal government is creating policies, so that the National Association of Real Estate Boards, the National Trade Group for Real Estate Brokers, forms in the 19-teens, and by 1924, it has already crafted a policy that any real estate broker who introduces someone of the opposite race in a racially homogenous area, so a real estate broker who engages in practices of integration will lose their license and their ability to practice real estate. And so that's long before the 1930s and the creation of the Federal Housing Administration. But people who were involved in that and in racist and segregated real estate practices are then recruited into the state to help shape its policies. And so all those kinds of best practices within real estate become attached to public policy making. And so then we get public policies that begin to reflect the bottom line and the objectives of real estate in many ways. But it's not just, I think it's important to say, and I certainly discuss this in some length in the book, that there are different pressures. There are pressures from above, but there are also pressures from below. African Americans want to be homeowners for all the same reasons that everyone else wants to be homeowners. They understand it not just in terms of its financial benefits, but because of the ways that it becomes associated with what it means to be an American, citizenship and national belonging. And so it's, you know, out of these kind of dual pressures that we get these new policies surrounding Black homeownership, but it's always on the basis that Black homeowners be contained to the city, that they essentially be segregated so as to not spoil the white housing market and the potential for ever rising property values in white communities. So there's a, you know, a complicated story that I'm trying to tell about the mutuality of the relationship with the public and private sectors here. Thank you, everyone.